Right, everybody. Last week, we were discussing the fact what chapters we're gonna follow, and then we tried to understand the basic idea of communio and the necessity of its renewal. That's where we came from, and I'm trying to move on to the next topic now. Last week we found out not only that they are Lutheran nuns, which is quite good to know, but we also found out that when we're talking about new forms of religious life, that we also need to talk about the experience of every single individual, and ask ourselves, we've got this experience, this individual experiences of one side, and we've got the communio and its demands on the other side, and how do they fit together? So this is something we're gonna move on with. And we found out that this experience is some kind of cornerstone for religious communion. And we always have to figure out this relationship. So it's an engine of renewal. So if you're living in communion and you try to put up a new form of religious life, and you have got so many people saying like, nah, we never did this before and we don't want to do this, then you will stop the renewal. And if you got individuals in communio, like in orders or in any religious communio, saying, but we want to make a difference and we want to make a change, and these people meet the people saying, nah, we never did this for the last 20 years, then it's becoming very difficult. So this question is not a question of the 21st century, it's also a question in history, in the 16th century. And as you recall it, we went back to the monastic theology in the medieval times. And we're gonna jump back to this because we will be addressing this feature of experience for a few more seconds, and then we will move on to the fight between individual and communio, and then we move on to the 16th century and talk about the people who are running away from communio in order to set up new forms of communio. So I am sharing my screen, and you can just lay back and wonder what's happening. I am sharing my screen. There we go. And now we're going back to the idea of experiences. I told you, and we probably all know, that experiences is very important in this context when we're talking about new forms of religious life. And it's an experience marked as salvific, when then, however, this experience frees us directly, as Martin Luther has put it, to act for our neighbors. And in this way, and in all clarity, and we have, at least in the Lutheran Church, a very broad concept of communio, which relies on the personal experience on the one hand, but which also calls you to move on to your neighbor and say, look, you're part of this communio as well. Saying it like this and living it like this, that you need the individual and you need the one turning to the neighbor and the next one, and by therefore setting up a new form of religious life, we can say that this is an ecumenical or an interconfessional trace which is revealed here. In other words, but not less impressively, also in the 20th century, the Trappist monk Thomas Merton pointed out what I have said about Martin Luther. Well, he pointed out that the world responsibility of the religiously experienced people, which could not be replaced by a solely inner and thus deeply individual path of faith, is very important. So you always have to move on to the world to make a difference. Precisely, Thomas Merton says, and I quote, "It is not difficult to meditate in a quiet monastery about love, humility, grace, inner peace, and tranquility. But yet," Thomas Merton says, "no one is an island. A purely individualistic inner life without being touched by the suffering of others is not real." So you need to be touched, and in the moment you are touched by the suffering of others, you are setting up a new form of communal religious life. This is to say, in the words of Martin Luther again, the call to take the individual religious experience seriously and yet not keep it to yourself, but to make it concrete and make it fruitful for your neighbor and thus for the communio as such. And while doing this, and I explained it before, while doing this, you're setting up a new form of communio. Moreover, it again, what Thomas Merton has said, it again shows that new communities are nothing to worry about. The fact that they are new isn't a fact that should bother you. Rather, it's a surprise and it's a good way of living new religious life. So new communities are nothing to worry about, and they should not worry about their renewal as well. So if you're living in a communio and you got the feeling something has to change, walk on with the change. That's, as we say in German, that's the way the cookie crumbles, and otherwise the communio will die. In fact, new forms of living emerge from the interplay between individual and communal experience. And if they still fit the signs of the time given, they work perfectly well. But you don't have to be afraid of change. That's the basic point in any form of communal life. You don't have to be afraid. So if it still fits the signs of the time given, it works perfectly well. If not, things need to be changed, or religious communities will die if they not look out for the times given. To accentuate the solitary and common search for meaning, and it all goes together, and from that we've got the emerging new communities and new forms of religious life. To accentuate the solitary and common search for meaning by looking at the rules of the orders deepens the view of the already mentioned tension, but at the same time it also points beyond it in that way that the mutual dependence of individual and communio becomes even clearer. So that's what we're gonna do now. We follow this trace and we look at several rules from religious orders which are actually addressing this tension between individual spirituality or confessional identity and the idea of the communio. And from that we will find out how the interplay works and how new forms arise from that. Well, you might guess that these questions, which I have just addressed, are very, very old. And in fact, they are. They're dating back to the 4th century, and you see it already, Basilio di Cesarea. We need to rely on some assumption he actually has made during the 4th century with regard to communio in his rule of orders. He states, and I quote it in English and you see in Italian, Basilio states, the living together of several who pursue the same purpose is conducive to many things. That's his basic assumption. And that's actually the ground on which new forms of religious life can emerge. The living together of several who pursue the same purpose is conducive to many things. So if you don't work together, if you don't have the same vision, the same purpose, just go home. The preeminence thus lies explicitly with the communio. But there's more to this. According to Basil, conducive includes not only the satisfaction of needs, the procurement of what is otherwise lacking, but also and especially the fulfillment of the law of love given by God. So what he's actually saying is, if you want to be communio, and if you want to renew yourself, and then you have to make sure that your vision is clear. And in his case, it's the vision of the law of love given by God. The mission of a communio goes far beyond the gathering of religiously experienced people and is at the same time not an end in itself. And I guess that most new forms of religious life occur because old forms of religious life, or the people living in old forms of religious life, have forgotten the fact that they are not an end in themselves. So they just sit down and are not on the move anymore. So there are no seekers left. They are just dwellers. Well, Basilio teaches us the common vision, and thus also the common work on spiritual life is underlined, needs to be underlined. The fulfillment of the law of love can only succeed by living and working together. Because for this, in addition to the prayer rhythm of the communio, the self-knowledge of the individual, and thus also the recognition of one's own mistakes, is of great importance. So of course, communio fulfills a certain task, but it's not fulfilling the task in itself. It fulfills it for the higher good. Well, only external and different people could point out errors, and you need this to grow, could point out errors of and mistakes, and thus also the recognition of one's own mistakes is of great importance, and therefore you need the other people to do this. In short, in seclusion, and this is what Basil says, in seclusion it is not easy to get to know one's own errors, because one has no one to rebuke and gently and compassionately correct one. So you need the other persons to go forward and to find new forms of life. For Basil, then, it was a matter of correction for God's sake, not the exercise of blind and subjugating authority. And it's precisely this correction by the communio that helps the individual to grow on its spiritual journey, a journey that could even lead to new ways of religious life. And it is highly important that communio as such, the religious communio you're living in, that this communio is free enough to allow the individual to walk his or her own path beneath the common vision, okay, of course. Well, as I said before, and it's always important to point that out, the basis of both the common life and the beneficial help is found in the common mission of the communio, in its common vision. Basil concretizes this and states that, and I quoted, the efficacy of the Holy Spirit, which lies on the individual must be passed over to the communio. That's the main task any communio has to fulfill, and if they don't do this, they have to renew themselves. So the efficacy of the Holy Spirit, which lies on the individual, or the charism of the Holy Spirit that lies on the individual, must be passed over to communio. If this did not happen, the gifts of the Spirit would become useless because they are not used. And that's how it works in God's kingdom. And the gifts of the Spirit would become useless because they were not used, and the charism granted to the communio could not be effective. But this would be contrary to the main commandment of all common life if the charism doesn't come into life. That would be contrary to the main commandment of all common life, which is to love God first and then one's neighbor, and to live accordingly to this claim. This is also emphasized by the Augustinian rule, which is still fundamental for numerous religious communities, especially Catholic orders, and has become increasingly binding since the 11th century. Again, it's also a point of renewal, addressing the point, be clear about your vision, be clear about the main commandment, and then move on. So only if the tension between the I and the we is negotiated on the basis of the common mission for the sake of God, it has the chance to be shaped in a way that it is useful for life. And this is the anonymous view of Basil and the Augustinian rule at the same time. Well, but what does that mean in concrete terms? Basil proves himself to be a connoisseur of inner processes in the communio when he states the following: a battlefield, a good way to progress, a constant practice and care of the commandments of the Lord is what living together as brothers is all about. So living together is a battlefield. Similar to Bernardo of Clairvaux, he asked himself the question, where else could the measure of correction be experienced if people are not living together? Where else could the measure of correction can be experienced if people are not living together? Where else would the chance arise to progress on one's own path of sanctification? And where could the necessary humility be learned, which was demonstrated so impressively in the scene of Jesus washing the feet of his disciples? You can only learn this in communio. And if communio does not provide this, you need a new form. Again, we are coming back to the point that communio always needs to renew itself. This learning path would be faster and more intense in a communio that is called by Christ to be, and I quote from the Bible, to be one heart and one soul. Here in this communio, the experience arises that such a life only succeeds in rare cases. Of course, we are not one heart and one soul, although we are called to be this. Therefore, negotiations between the individual and the communio for the sake of God must take place with great intensity. It is therefore understandable that the Benedictine rule from the early 6th century, which is also fundamental for today's religious communities, by the way, even for Lutheran religious orders, because we've got one branch in Germany relying on the Benedictine rule, but still it's in Lutheran order. So fundamental for today's religious communities, this Benedictine rule advocates comparing the common life to a struggle. Each monk, as Benedict says, each monk fought an individual battle, or more precisely, a battle against loneliness and against his own personal faults of the flesh and of the mind. And without the helping and also correcting communio, this fight could not be won, even if such fights could certainly force the tensions in the communio. Well, to resolve this tension, or to expel the people, or to find new forms of living, this was and is the task especially of those who bore and bear responsibility in the communio, because it is their first task to preserve unity within the communio, as the rule of the Lutheran Fraternity of Christ, and this is my order, says. The rule of Benedict, therefore, inculcates in the abbot, and it's his task to strive with all wisdom and prudence that he, the abbot, lose none of the sheep entrusted to him. That's your basic job. Otherwise, communio does not work. Make sure that you don't lose the sheep entrusted to you. This basic orientation towards the individual should prevent human sympathy or antipathy from hindering the individual's spiritual journey. The rule of St. Francis from the year 1223 takes this point further and completely in the sense of Francis of Assisi, addressing the fact that the soul of the confreres, the soul of the brothers, is entrusted to the individual. And you always have to keep that in mind. The soul of your brother and the soul of your sister is entrusted to you. And therefore, any kind of communio needs to take care of this, and despite the fact that it needs to take care of the vision God has granted, but it needs to take care of the brothers and sisters entrusted to you. Therefore, should one, and we're going back to St. Francis, therefore, should one be lost through one's own bad example, the offender has to justify himself on the day of judgment. The urgent call to shape and, if necessary, to resolve the tension between the individual and the communio is also taken into account by the rule of the Evangelical Fraternity of Christ, which states, and I quote from our rule, "Do not stick to the provisionality, do not stick to the provisionality of sympathy and antipathy. Rather, it's a matter of recognizing, and I quote again, the shadowy of your life and the lives of your sisters and brothers, and precisely for this reason of granting them, and I quote again, the wide space of God's goodness. That's our task. Grant the others the wide space of God's goodness. Otherwise, communio does not work. In other words, the mutual care that shines forth here calls for concrete action. And we've discovered that already when we were talking about Martin Luther. It calls for concrete action. In this case, for vicarious prayer for the brothers and sisters. Similarly, the rule of Benedict calls on brothers and sisters to, and I quote, to precede one another with reverence, while the rule of St. Francis emphasizes that all should always strive to help one another spiritually and, in case of doubt, to, I quote, admonish and instruct and rebuke the brother humbly and gently. Only in communio, as Basil had already intoned, the sinner could, and I quote, tear himself away from sin and be strengthened on his own spiritual path. So I guess now we've got it quite clear, the importance of communion, and I guess we need to turn to the individual as well, addressing this. Well, and let me sum up before we do this. Basically, all the great rules of religious life, as well as the evangelical, the Lutheran rules of the present day, emphasize and make it clear that the tension between the individual and the communio must be addressed, especially with regard to the tension within the communio. With this, however, and here no illusions are cultivated in the rules of the orders, with this, however, the battlefield was not cleared up, but it has become clear that communio played and plays an important role in this specific battle, which was ultimately fought by the individual as a very specific spiritual existence. And this is not only by the help communio offers, but also by the increased reflection of the individual, who for this very reason could and can hardly escape the processes of common life. So never underestimate the processes of common life. Yeah. Now let us sum up this sort of introducing chapter about spirituality, communio, and the reasons why communio always needs to renew itself. And practically that's the reason why we discover a lot of new forms of religious life throughout history. Let us state this: lonely and common search for meaning stand in a tense and at the same time interdependent relationship. In this context, the momentum of communio was and is actualized in situations of upheaval here. Here, the relationship between the individual and the communio is redefined. So we need to address the context and the setting as well. That's the basic point. And as I said last week, it's usually a time of upheaval. And when we're moving on to the 20th century, we discover when new forms in Lutheran Church emerged, we will discover that again. A brief look at monastic theology, at the reflection of individual religious and the various religious rules from different centuries, has shown us that these processes of negotiation have been conducted in varying intensity. However, the relationship between individual religious experience and the corrective actions of the communio has never been dissolved, but has been accentuated differently in each case. This suggests that the formation of individual spirituality, the binding community plays an important role. Moreover, we need to draw the conclusions that any standstill in the development of the communio has direct consequences to the spiritual existence of the individual. Therefore, it had to be made sure that individual and communio fight the constant battle of renewal. That's the basic idea. If you haven't learned anything from what I said before, that's the basic idea. Every communio has to make sure that individual and communio fight the constant battle of renewal. Otherwise, it won't work out. This also seems plausible in view of the basic assumption that monastic theology, as well as the reflections and the rules of religious orders, make up to the present day, namely, communal life was and is understood as a response to the essence of the triune God, who is thought of as communal within himself. Starting from this tension between the individual religious experience and the communio has never been resolved, but it has created a framework in which this could and can be negotiated in the most life-serving way. So you can't take out this tension, but you can come as close to a life-serving way as possible. Ultimately, then, the indispensability of communio derives from its, in practice, sometimes merciless because relentless service to the spiritual journey of the individual. So it is very important at the present time to point out the basis of the communio and its important service to the individual, because community, like emerging movements and other tiny groups assembling around pretty charismatic leaders, are booming again today. So we need to consider all these fields we have discovered so far, addressing the individual, addressing the communio, and then have a sort of folio that we can put on the situation today. However, these booming groups with pretty charismatic leaders, they sometimes appear also in religious circles, rather in the form of echo chambers and self-referential peer groups, and not like orders with a great variety of people in them. This means that the life-serving function of communio that goes beyond the individual now requires special consideration. It seems as if the service is at stake at the moment, since the tension between communio and the individual is called off. If you remember what I said last week about the prayer house movement and so forth, then we discussed the fact that these movements mainly serve the individual and the self-optimized religious identity of the individual. And the question is whether this puts the service of the communio as such at stake. So what happens to the vision of communio? What happens to the service of communio if the individual moves that much forward, goes that much into the foreground? And the question is whether this tension between communio and individual is in a way solved by the fact that the individual has won. But what happens to the service then? To judge this contemporary phenomenon we're discovering in the Lutheran and in the Catholic Church right now, borrowings can be easily made from the history of religious orders in religious theology, and we've seen that. But still, one aspect needs to be mentioned to emphasize the power of communio and the power of its renewal. And now we turn to another topic, leaving the open questions behind. So what's the last point, in a way, we need to address concerning the power of communio and the power of its renewal? We are talking about the very special task, a very special task communio can fulfill and has to fulfill if they get into their environment and make sure that they are familiar with the questions, structures, and challenges that surround them. So again, no one is an island. You need to move on to your neighbor, and not addressing the question individual wins over communio, but as a communio, move on to your neighbor And here you've got a special task. And I'd like to address the special task, and I'd like to introduce you to some sociological ideas concerning that. But wait, it might be a surprise. The illusory communio. The illusory communio is the title of a small volume by the French anthropologist Marc Augé. And this book was published in German in the year 2015. Here in his book, Augé asked how communities are composed and where the impression actually comes from that they form a unit, that they can actually be understood as a communio due to their unity. This actually rather hope for unity, we've been talking about the tensions, Augé continues critically, this rather hope for unity does not exist at all, that's his point, but it is rather an illusion. That's what the title of the book comes from. It is rather an illusion, or if it is to be formulated less sharply, an ideal. Communio is an ideal, therefore it cannot renew itself. And even more, because communio was an ideal in the sense of Augé, the communities in reality never get beyond the project status. They are therefore never finished or perfect, and unity in diversity is never fully achieved in them. That's his basic idea. Any communio is always in the status of a project, never finished, never fully achieves unity in diversity. And if you want to move on with that thought, we need to say never capable of achieving the vision and the mission God has granted. Whoever, for whatever reason, feels part of a communio, Augé says, therefore for his own sake, has the task of accepting the unfinished, has the task of accepting the fact that the communio constantly needs improvement and constantly needs renewal. So everybody has to accept the provisional and the inadequate, and at the same time the fact that communio always needs to be improved. Otherwise, it would vanish. These assessments, and I know they're quite strict if you're living in communio, then you have to gasp when you're reading this book. These assessments finally allow Augé to come to the conclusion that the term communio, and apparently new communio as well, that the term communio seemed not to suit further reflections. It was simply not worth it. That's his point. It's simply not worth it to think about it. It could be dispensed, since communio needed to be regarded as an experiment and therefore should be forgotten. Well, whoever lives in a communio knows about its inadequacies and the provisional and also the unfinished character of it. Having said this, it is also obvious that it is quite true that talking about communio always means talking about an ideal. And the question is, what then does it mean talking about new forms and a renewal? Maybe it's just the renewal of an ideal. Well, anyway, it means talking about an ideal. It means talking about desires and about fears, so that it really must be examined whether the concept of communio should not be shelved or not. However, Marc Augé, who has already been mentioned, also emphasizes that the necessity of communio, despite his reservations, does exist. There is a necessity of communio. This has to do with the fact that to communio alone, or in his language, to the ideal of communio, he attributes the eminently important capacity to prevent or even end totalitarian systems. I know that sounds totally weird, but that's an interesting idea, which also will follow up with the thoughts about renewal of communio. So the basic idea of Marc Augé is you need the provisional communio. This is eminently important to prevent and or even end totalitarian systems. This sounds awkward and great at the same time. So let us entertain this a bit further. Totalitarian systems, according to Marc Auger, not only exercise meaning, but they also destroy all areas of public life. In other words, they isolate the individual, drive the individual into isolation, and ultimately aim to destroy private life as such. The consequence was that now lonely people, not being part of a communio, lonely people are no longer experiencing themselves as belonging to the world. And this is painful. This is painful if you experience yourself as not being part of the world that surrounds you. And according to Hannah Arendt, this was the, and I quote her, the most radical and desperate experience of man as such. Because a specific meaning was now prescribed to the person that was not his own. So in a way, what Auger addresses is that he says, totalitarian systems, the aim of totalitarian system is to prescribe something to the individual person which is not the basic identity and the basic idea of the individual person. And in the end, if this happens, and if this succeeds, and I guess the German and Italian history provide a lot of examples for this, if this succeeds, this makes life meaningless. In short, totalitarian systems ensure that the life of the individual loses its meaning and cements its isolation. Here we are talking about political totalitarian systems, but you can easily turn it into the institutional power of churches as well. And we can also talk about the orders and the fact that violence or power or hierarchies or whatsoever cement a churchy totalitarian system as well. Now, according to Auger, we're moving on from that. According to Auger, communio also could lead into isolation, but, and this is absolutely important, but it refuses association and thus the complete destruction of private individuality. So his point is to say, of course, you are lonely in communio, but your individuality is not destroyed. And it's not, well, to be precise, it's not completely destroyed. And why is that? And here we come to the point why communio as such, if it's vital and if it's renewing itself, is so important in strict hierarchical totalitarian systems. It is because the fact, it is due, or let's put it this way, it's due to the fact that communio is an idea, a provisional arrangement, and something unfinished. That's the secret of it. The fact is that communio is an idea, a provisional arrangement, and something unfinished, which always requires reflection, and which always, and we've seen it in the religious orders and their rules, which always requires negotiation, and which always requires reconstruction. Ideally, the communion knows that its values and orders are provisional and practical imperatives, that they are to be reviewed constantly with all due respect, and that they are called to be changed if necessary. Whoever enters into communio, no matter what, an emerging religious communio of today, or even order or anything like this, whoever enters communio, therefore, consents to its always unfinished character. We know that when we're becoming part of the order. Thus, communio stands in blatant contradiction to all totalitarian systems of explaining the world with one single explanation, explaining the world which are not based on negotiation and change, but on enforcement of a single view and a very specific truth. Thus, if the world is not to be dominated by totalitarian systems, it is highly necessary to build and maintain communio again and again, and also to expose oneself to its challenges. I said before that we should not be afraid of new communios arising. We should not be afraid of new forms of religious life. And one idea why we should not be afraid of experiencing that is the point Marc Auger is making. Because he says, if you are afraid and if you stick to your hierarchies and if you're sticking to the fact that only one specific truth exists, and this enforcement of this one specific truth does not allow the individual to breathe within the communio, then you're having a severe problem. And the problem is that you first of all establish a hierarchical and maybe a totalitarian system, but in the end, since nobody, to put it in a picture, nobody can actually breathe, then this communio will die. Of course, you leading such a communio will have the power for a moment, but in the end, you will die because it's not serving life what is happening here. So maybe you disagree with the points Marc Auger is making, but his point behind that actually is make sure that you move on the path of renewal. Make sure that you embrace the challenge of negotiation and make sure that you embrace the tension between individual thoughts and basic vision of communio. If you don't do this, then this communio, and I follow his lines now, this communio will actually die. So again, if you put that in a nutshell, you come to the point that new forms of religious life, as long as they are not sectarian or pretty weird in their confession or something like that, new forms of religious life are no danger. In fact, they are an invitation. They are an invitation to sort of negotiate or to rediscover the basic line of the communio that was actually granted to the communio. Now, we're having a little break. I know you need a break, and so do I. And we're coming back at 3 o'clock. And during the break, figure out, do you have any question or something? And we start off with question, and then we move on. So I see you at 3 o'clock.
Thanks.
Right. And I do share my screen again, and you can relax and take a flight into history. Right, here we go. And whenever you got a question or anything is unclear, just say, hey, wait. And then we talk about this. Now, after walking through general thoughts about communio and the necessity to renew itself, let us now turn to our first historical chapter and move back to the early modern period. Here we will take a look at new forms of communio emerging during a very precarious period of time, and I want you to keep in mind what I have said about the struggle of individual and communio, what I have said about the tension, and what I have said about the necessity of the vision of God and the mission of the communio. So now we put that on an example while being on the move during the 16th century. So we are going to a very precarious period of time. And in fact, here we are supposed to find out how the Reformation era, dealt with old forms of monastic communio and how these forms of life were dismissed because that's what was one of the basic ideas of the Reformation. These forms of life were dismissed, and what had been offered instead? Because new forms of religious life not just simply emerge. Usually, old forms die, but the fact is, and we discover that today, I guess, also, the fact is there's some sort of sense and there's some sort of desire for communio and for religious communio in society. So you just can't dismiss a form of religious life and say that's gone, don't be religious anymore. You cannot do this. You have to provide new answers and you have to provide new forms. If you look at the order of St. Francis or Dominicus or others, and they all dismissed very old forms of monastic life, but provided new forms of monastic life. And the same thing will happen, the same thing did happen during the age of Reformation. Now, addressing the point that old forms were dismissed, but new form needed to be offered, addressing this leads us to the Reformation as such. Yet, Reformation era, early 16th century, first half of the 16th century, does not mean that all orders have been abolished at once. Of course, you cannot do this, and you can't really, that's a practical thing. You can't say, go, and they are gone. That's not happen. In fact, we also need to look at new forms of monastic life that came out of efforts to reform existing structures and alignment of the orders. So we've got both ways during that period of time. We've got a reform movement within the orders, and we've got the Reformation movement saying, no, folks, leave the orders and find a new way of religious life, find new forms of religious life. All in all, during this chapter, we will ask what steps were taken to achieve the goal to reform while reaching out for new forms of communio. Additionally, and as an example, we will take a look at new forms of communitarian life within the age of Reformation, issued, for instance, by the Anabaptist movement, while addressing the power of the so-called common man, meaning everybody like you and me. But I guess we're going to do this next week. So this week, we're taking the first step. So let us now turn to Martin Luther and his thoughts about monasteries and their form of communio first. Now you have to be strong if you're living in a monastery. Well, I have to be strong since I live in a monastery. Now, Martin Luther says, a monastery is a light in which the devil is abbot and prior, and the monks and nuns are the damned souls. This is what Martin Luther wrote to Duke George of Saxony in the year 1533, after the latter had accused him of being a perjured monk, since Luther had left his monastery and thus had broken his promise of profession, the promise of his eternal vows. Again, a monastery is a light in which the devil is abbot and prior, and the monks and nuns are the damned souls. That's quite heavy stuff, to be honest. I'm writing that to a duke. To a Catholic duke. Luther then justified his sharp statement in detail by referring to, and I quote him, by referring to the baptism of monks, which were wrongly regarded as a second and more valuable baptism than anyone else's baptism. So the basic idea behind that was everybody is baptized, so that's quite good. But then you, as a nun, as a brother, as a sister, as a monk, you're taking the eternal vows. And by doing this, they needed to be regarded as a second baptism, making you much better than everybody else who was baptized before. So the baptism of monks was highly criticized by Martin Luther. Luther also referred to the ideal of perfection, with which monks and orders set themselves apart from all other people, And he also referred to the vows, which were blasphemous works in his sense. And he all explained it in this specific letter in the year 1533. They, I mean the works and the vows, they, Luther stated, only served their own sanctifications. So the monks and nuns in the monastery only served their own sanctification. There's no word of Christ, Luther said, no word of Christ concerning monasteries. And guess why? Because they are not necessary. That's his point. No word of Christ concerning monastery. There's no word of the grace of God, which nullifies all self-interest and all self-righteousness. And there's no word of baptism in the monasteries, which alone is sufficient to keep all people in a covenant with God. So to draw the bottom line, or to put it in a nutshell, monasteries, from Luther's point of view, and I quote him, were rat's nests. Were rat's nests, he stated, and should urgently be stormed and torn down, abolished and dismissed. Whoever follows this trace of Luther from the year 1533 can only assume that there would never be monasteries within the Lutheran Church. No orders, no monasteries. Of course not. And indeed, the German church historian Bernd Möller recorded in his reflection on the marriage of the theologian Wenzel Link, a friend of Martin Luther, just this. In the year 2000, Möller noted, and I quote it for you, the church historian Möller noted, one can virtually define Protestantism as the church without monks, without nuns, and without celibates. To this day, the divorce of the denominations is unbridged at this point. That's what he said. In short, the Lutheran Church had identified religious orders as, I quote, foreign bodies, and was henceforth to be a zone free of orders. And this very fact, Möller argued, marked an important and hitherto unbridged difference to the Catholic Church. That's what he said in the year 2000. What Möller apparently did not know was what you all know, and that currently, in contemporary times, Protestant communities, orders in Germany do exist. At the moment, we're about 21 of these Protestant orders, like religious congregations within the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Germany, in which sisters and brothers live a celibate life. Yes, they do exist today. These orders call themselves communities and are mainly seated in the Bavarian Regional Church, and even the largest one is located here. And the largest one, which is my community, has 103 sisters and 3 brothers, so it's quite big actually. In addition, there are also Protestant communities which are either pure family communities, like they don't live a celibate life, or even both, a celibate and a family branch. At present, we can assume a total of about 60 evangelical communities and orders, which are organized by the Evangelical Church of Germany, the EKD, at the latest in 2007, which are recognized by the Evangelical Church of Germany at the latest as 2007 as an, and I quote, as an integral and indispensable part of the Lutheran Church in Germany. Nevertheless, and at this point some credit needs to be given to Möller, nevertheless, these evangelical orders, which need to be regarded as a new form of monastic life, were not appreciated at first. Precisely because of such statements by Martin Luther, we have started this section, and due to the value and strength of his narratives. So when Luther says, no, we don't need the orders due to the critics he has, then the Lutheran historiography says, okay, we don't need this. And that moved on through the 18th and 19th century right into contemporary times. The strength of narratives, that's the baseline of it. Consequently, from the first founding movement in the early 20th century, it took until the year 1979 before the evangelical church in Germany began to come to terms with religious orders in its midst. But finally, they succeeded to accept this new form of communitarian life. But as you can see, it's a long way. It took almost 500 years to accept this. Accepting evangelical orders happened pretty late, we can assume that. And this was due to the Protestant, as I said before, to the Protestant historiography of the 19th and early 20th century, which denied the existence of orders in the midst of the Lutheran Church. But primarily, it was also due to the constant and one-sided invocation of Martin Luther, who did not spare pithy formulations against monasticism and also liked to bundle this attitude into the image that the monasteries was, and I quote him, a prison of human tyranny. Monasteries as a prison of human tyranny, and that everybody should be eager to care about saving the captive consciences by making the monasteries empty. So we're going back to the 16th century saying, okay, it might be understandable that the evangelical church during the 20th century and 21st century could not come to terms with Lutheran orders. And I pointed out the strength of the narratives addressed to Martin Luther, stating that it's highly important to make the monasteries empty because the conscience is kept in there in a very insane way. Luther was not the only one. Now we're going fully back to the 16th century, going fully into the discussions, do we need monastery and what forms of religious life do we need within the emerging evangelical Lutheran Church? Luther was not the only one assessing the situation in this very specific way. On the contrary, numerous other voices from the time of the Reformation movement could be added here. In the year 1521 to 1524, in particular, this period of time saw a significant number of publications, mostly coming from Wittenberg, the hometown of Martin Luther, mostly coming from Wittenberg as the place of printing, in which former religious people, and I mean former monks and former nuns, justified their resignation from the order or their adventurous way at some point, their adventurous way of fleeing from the monastery. In fact, and this is very, very interesting, if you ever get into the 16th century asking for new forms of religious life, you are absolutely directed to the people fleeing from the monasteries and explaining why they left, although they couldn't leave. And these are very, very interesting sources. Well, this period saw the first major wave of resignations and closures of orders, although exact numbers can hardly be given. But I give you a number. The historian Eike Wolgast gives a rough overview when he states that in the Holy Roman Empire of German nation, that's what the nation, the state was called, the Holy Roman Empire of German nation, around 1500, the year 1500, there were about 2,550 monasteries with monks and nuns. But around the middle of the 17th century, there were only 1,350 left of them. So you can see there was a movement. There was a movement fleeing from the monasteries. Also, there would have been 75 convents with nuns that had become Protestant during that period. I mean, during the 16th century. So people were not only fleeing from the monastery, we've got also 75 convents by nuns where the nuns actually turned the Catholic monastery into a Lutheran monastery. Interesting enough. These figures and the intensity of the letters of justification from former nuns and monks led the historian Antje Rüttgart, and I wrote her name wrong, so it's NT and not M, Antje Rüttgart. She came to the conclusion that in this case, we are dealing with, and I quote her, we are dealing with a central phenomenon of upheaval. A central phenomenon of upheaval, my goodness, of upheaval of a great extent that can only be compared with the introduction of priestly marriage, of priest's marriage. So what she's actually saying is, discovering how many people, how many monks and nuns actually fled from the monastery can only be compared to the introduction of priest marriage, which was a severe and huge and big thing during that period of time. Well, in fact, Antje Rüttgart can easily state this, realizing how tense and harsh the debates were when the first priestly marriage occurred in Wittenberg or in Strasbourg. To give you an impression of the intensity, let me state that in Strasbourg, even wives like Katharina Zell defended her husband, the preacher of the Cathedral of Strasbourg, a former priest, and she was doing this by breaking gender hierarchies and boundaries. So it was that intense and that severe, and it affected much more than just religious questions or theological questions. It also affected social hierarchies and boundaries. Well, consequently, Antje Rüttgart also speaks of a new literary form that emerged in the course of the resignations, because now a whole generation wanted to give an account of their monastery resignation. They wanted to explain why they left, and by doing this, they created their own public sphere while giving insights into their ideas of monastic life. When I said before, these are very interesting sources, I really meant it. It is remarkable that also numerous women participated in it. So many women were actually writing why they left the monastery. This, addressing the women, this is a new form of participation in public discourse. And maybe it's an own sphere. Anyway, it's a new form of participation in public discourse. And these, I say it in German first, these Apologien und Verantwortung wieder des unchristlichen Wesen der Möncherei und Nonnerei, this is what the papers are called, these ways of explaining, and I translate it now, these ways of explaining that monasteries needed to be regarded as less Christian than anything else, as Luther has called this literary form in his 1528 reflection on Ursula von Münsterberg's escape from the convent, quite obviously focused on the subject and less on the contemporary gender hierarchy. In other words, and this is important to know, suddenly women could take their stand, at least for a moment, before the empire managed to strike back, to put it in a Star Wars term, before the empire managed to strike back, meaning before church officials put their disregard in severe language. For a moment, there was a time where women publicly explained why they could no longer live in a monastery, and where they publicly explained what they actually believed and why they had to leave, why they had to run away, despite the fact that they knew that they will have a severe problem, because nobody would marry them after they have left the monastery, and they will be in severe economical troubles because they have no job, etc., etc. And now you can see the urge, the inner urge of the woman, and they published about this. Very, very interesting to read. But let us state the following as highly important. This discourse about resignation and fleeing, this discourse did not end in the year 1524. Rather the contrary, as late as 1541, as you can see on the slide, the Weimar Franciscan monk Friedrich Myconius wrote a history about the Reformation in which he includes accounts about monasticism. So he kept on dealing with the topic. But of course, the climax of the controversy had already been passed at that time. To be more precise, as early as the year 1528, Martin Luther declared that there was now as he said it, an overabundance of these writings. An overabundance of these writings that, and I quote him, that the children in the streets were already singing enough of them. In other words, Luther was fed up with the accounts bashing the monastic form of life. In fact, he wanted to put the debate on another level by introducing his notions of critic and by considering alternative forms of religious life. So we've got two interesting discourses at the time. The one discourse is created by the people, the monks and the nuns leaving the monastery. And the second discourse now starts with the basic ideas of Martin Luther to put the critics on another level and say, now look, what's the theological point behind the critics? And if we come to terms with the theological point, then we might and we have to consider alternative forms of religious life. In terms of content, none of the early modern contemporaries in this debate were able to get past the insights Martin Luther had presented in his writing Devotis Monasticis Judicium. And I thought, in our circle, I don't need to translate the Latin, because since you are all capable of Italian, Latin should not be a problem. Devotis Monasticis Judicium, that might even help us, which he had begun writing in the year 1521 and finally published it in the year 1522. Here, essential points of criticism of monastic life are named and deepened. It's a very long writing, and I recommend reading it to you. These insights became quite prominent. Martin Luther's followers took them from this paper in a more or less elaborate way and added them to further writings justifying their resignations. These critic thoughts include, firstly, the assertion that monastic life with the associated obligation of profession could not be explained by the Holy Scripture. That was his main point. We've got profession in monastic life, the eternal vows, and this could not be explained by the Holy Scripture. And therefore, it had to be understood exclusively as a work of man. And you don't have to be a theologian to know that this is a quite harsh critic, very harsh critic. Secondly, the justification of works is rejected in Luther's writing. Salvation needed to be attained solely through the grace of God. We were talking about this last week. His idea of justification. Justification was solely due to the grace of God and thus through life. And what is not of faith is simply sin. That's how Luther put it. What is not of faith is simply sin. If then, Luther continues, vows, and especially eternal vows, the profession, could not be derived from faith, then nobody could simply be acquitted to them. And it is precisely to this acquittal that scripture then is put forward when Luther states, and I quote, and this is something you have to remember during the night, aus dem universus monachus a suis votis absolvere et cum fiducia pronunciare vota eorum esse coram Deo reproba et nulla. So I dare to tell all these monks and nuns that they are free, that I absolve them from their vows. And imagine Martin Luther saying this. This is really weird. And if I were the Pope in that period of time, I would be shrieking. So I absolve you from the vows. Coram Deo, it is possible to refrain from them and to understand that they are nothing. This is undoubtedly a top sentence in his writing Devotis Monasticis Judicium, a top sentence which had to lead to the understanding of the religious life henceforth only as a possible and sometimes just temporary form of life, but nothing more. You don't take the vows for eternity anymore, because you cannot do this. That's his point. Renewal was not the demand that needed to be met. In fact, Martin Luther tells the monks and nuns that eternal vows, that profession, was not necessary. Therefore, both monks and nuns were freed by Martin Luther from their promise. Coram Deo, this happened. They could leave the monastery without any harm and therefore abolish this form of life. And let me add this. This is a highly important sentence because usually, and I'd like to draw your attention back to the letter to the Duke of Saxony with which I started in the year 1533. And the Duke of Saxony was writing to Martin Luther, you know what? You were a former monk and you left the monastery, so you sort of lost your salvation. You have lost your salvation because you promised something to God and you are not keeping the promise. So the fear when you are leaving monasteries in the 16th century is you are lost, your soul is lost. And now Martin Luther turns up and says, no, this is not the truth. The truth is you can leave and you are free to leave. So now you can understand the very, very difference we're discovering right now. So it comes very close to a complete abolishment of monastic life as such. And it would be interesting to see what's the alternative. But it's also important to know from which direction actually Martin Luther is coming. And he's coming from the direction of liberty, of freedom. You choose to be part of it, and if you don't want to be part of this anymore, you shall be free to leave. That's his point. But this is so prominent and so different from the situation we find during the 16th century. So that's revolutionary in a way, and that's explosive. And of course it exploded. Of course it did. But it's important to understand that he's coming from the idea of freedom, from the idea of liberty, and saying, yeah, of course you can promise and you should promise, but you should only, and that's a lifelong lesson, you should only promise what you can actually keep as a promise. And no one can keep an eternal promise. That's his idea. Well, Luther elaborates further points that were then taken up by his epigones. This applies in particular to the reference to the freedom of conscience. That's what I was addressing right now. And that was granted, the conscience that was granted by baptism, and that should not be undermined by vows. And we've been going through this point already, the second baptism. Baptism, Luther states, makes it possible in the first place that man does not have to rely on works, and therefore can apparently avoid vows or mortifications. Moreover, Luther states to rely on vows would contradict the commandments of God, which just served to look not at oneself, but at God. And ultimately, the vows kept the monks and nuns from doing good to the poor and the sick, since they just concentrated on themselves. That was his critics. You forget about your baptism, you regard yourself as something special, and while doing this, you're forgetting to look out for the poor and the sick, and you just concentrate on yourself and your perfection. Moreover, Luther states in his writings, we're still going with Devotis Monasticis, moreover, vows contradicted reason. That's another argument. Vows contradict reason. It is highly valuable to elaborate these critiques further, but for now, we need to keep in mind that Luther strongly emphasizes that monks and nuns should not stand in the way of the Holy Spirit or in the way of the works of God. Consequently, they have to leave the monastery, and they should and could do this due to the freedom of conscience. And consequently, moreover, new forms of religious life needed to be established. Well, Martin Luther, just to have a little footnote to this, Martin Luther addressed further aspects. Not all of them were taken up in follow-up writings. One issue that was not taken up in a proper way, I'd say, was Luther's reflection on the commandment of procreation from Genesis 1:28, which made the gift of chastity appear to be an exceptional gift of God. So apparently he was very, very much addressing the gift of chastity. Luther issued that this gift was not very common. In fact, he claims so many monasteries claim to live up to the ideal of chastity, but in fact, this did not work out for them. The gift, and that's his basic idea, it's a gift. The gift granted by God was not put into practice in most of the monasteries, he states. Consequently, Luther draws the conclusion that precisely this vow could be kept in only a few monasteries. Monasteries, therefore, were to be called Lupanaria Satanae, Satan's brothels, because they could not keep the gift of chastity. Moreover, in his letters to various convent women who were thinking about escaping from their monastery, Luther never got tired of pointing out that it was hardly possible for a large number of women to live chastity. And I'd say, oh my goodness, here we are again, 16th century gender attitude. Well, he always told them, especially women are not able to live up to the gift of chastity. After all, God created their bodies to be with a man, to become pregnant and to raise children. So they shouldn't be in monasteries. Chastity was not intended to be lived by women in a proper way. And of course, he has a suggestion what else to do, and he suggests to the woman, instead of being part of a monastery, instead of being nun, you should rather go find a husband and get married and have children. Of course, that's his basic idea and his way of putting a new form of religious life into practice. Now, Luther's writing Devotis Monasticis and the accompanying dedicatory letter to his father inspired a whole generation to think about themselves, about being monks and nuns. One of them, and now we get into this, one of them, for example, was the former Franciscan Johannes Schwan, coming from Marburg, who in a letter cites almost everything Luther had pointed out, but then places his emphasis on scolding his particular form of life. Monks, Schwan almost shouted in his writings, monks had to be regarded, and I quote, as servants of the belly and as enemies of grace, because they would live their whole life only to pull money and property from the pockets of poor people. They also needed to be regarded as, and I quote again, as unlearned and spiritless, since they had never read the Bible, but only the church fathers, and had considered the church to be the gospel. And they considered themselves to be holy in a very specific and exceptional way. Moreover, their whole life and actions had to be regarded as an outward work with which they set up a prison for their conscience and suppressed faith. This is harsh critique. Ultimately, according to Schwan, this, and I quote it again, this monkish spirituality was worse than all forms of Jewish piety. So this is really severe and very harsh. Monkish spirituality, as Schwan has put it, was worse than all forms of Jewish piety. Luther's supposedly harsh attitude, however, also inspired people like the Nuremberg council clerk Lazarus Spengler, who presumably wrote to the Dominican nun Barbara von Ploben, and again you find the names here, wrote to Barbara von Ploben in early 1525, giving the title Contra Vitam Monasticam, against monastic life, while urging her, Barbara, to leave the convent. In his writing, Spengler sharply underlined the human work and the attitude of the orders. He pointed out how selfish monks and nuns were, addressing their desire to become holy by works. So again, you can sort of collect the whole critics. It's about the vows, it's about the works, and it's about the self-understanding. And again, it's about baptism. And the same goes with Spengler, because he detected denial of baptism in his letter to Barbara von Ploben. He detected denial of baptism, the ungodliness of the vows, and finally, he detected a lifestyle that belied the vow of poverty. But there was much more to it, a promise, a monastic profession, the eternal vows, which aimed at consolidating such conditions and which was not chosen freely. Again, the idea of freedom, which was not chosen freely, could not be binding. Here you hear Martin Luther calling vows like this, which were not taken and chosen freely, could not be binding. God could therefore not look upon the religious life of Barbara von Ploben with favor, he wrote to her, which was quite difficult for her to read. Well, God could not look upon the religious life of her with favor, since in the end, he, God, wanted to have voluntary servants and children, and not forced servants and children. Well, in the same year, Barbara von Ploben left the convent in Nuremberg after reading this. All in all, Schwan and Spengler referred to Luther, and even in the language it is recognizable that and how they learned from Devotis Monasticis. And yet, they did not do justice to his more differentiated approach, his meaning Luther's. This is due to the fact that both Spengler and Schwan, regardless of the radicality of their arguments, could not or would not conclude that orders as such should not be abolished. In fact, they both totally abolished this very specific form of religious life. And this, and now we're coming to the Reformed New Form, this was different from the things Martin Luther stated. So let us again, at the end of our lecture, listen to Martin Luther again and hear the differentiated view of him. In the year 1537, when asked about the treatment of monastery, he, Martin Luther, was still able to say that monks could certainly be left in their monasteries and that monasteries should certainly exist. In doing so, he underscored a thought that he had already formulated in the year 1524 in a letter to 3 monastic women, to 3 nuns. Here, he had advised them to remain in the monastery if they enjoyed the freedom of reading God's word there. Again, the freedom, if they enjoyed the freedom of reading God's work there. He also encouraged them to do what he called monastic monastic works. And he also sets an example, what are monastic works? And then he goes on, and I quote this because it's so funny, like spinning, cooking, and the like. So these were the monastic words from Luther's point of view. So he encouraged them to stay there. Moreover, he says, as long as they did not seek their salvation by their works, meaning spinning, cooking, and the like would help me to get holy, as long as they do not do this, there would be no obligation for them to leave the monastery. And Luther added some more thoughts. If they were not given the freedom to stay in the monastery, he wrote to the ladies, if they were not given the freedom to stay at the moment, then he suggests they should leave and, if necessary, rejoin at a later time. So this sounds weird, doesn't it? First of all, he says, hey, no, let's get rid of all the monasteries. And suddenly he's writing letters like, you better stay in the monastery, you can do your works there, and if you're not free at the moment, why not leave the monastery and come back maybe in 5 years or something, and be part of the monastery. How can we explain this? And I don't want to use it as a cliffhanger for next week, so I explain it now. How can we explain this? These thoughts ultimately correspond with Luther's statements about a so-called third place. That's his idea, about a third place, which Luther deepened in the year 1525 in his preface to his writing about the German Mass. Here he describes a so-called third place of church alongside the Latin Mass and the German service, where all those gather, and now I quote him, where all those gather who earnestly desire to be Christians. That's his third place, where all those gather who earnestly desire to be Christians. His criticism of the abuse of the vows and the idea of the monks to reach grades of perfection by living their monastic life remains. But in the year 1536, following this track, Luther explicitly recognizes that ultimately until then, and I quoted from the original, viel heiliger Leut mit rechter Meinung in Klostern gelebt, well, he says that a lot of holy people have been living in monasteries so far. So the third place is the new form of religious life. The third place is the new form of religious life because Luther acknowledges that in the monasteries we've got holy people, as he put it. And he suggests that coming from that, we need to find a new form of religious life, and the new form relies on people who earnestly desire to be Christians and who live and pray together, and who did not worry about vows and monastic profession or eternal vows. These people were beared in mind by Luther when he was talking about the third place. And all in all, he was not talking about monks and nuns, but rather he was emphasizing that the third place was inhabited by pure believers who heavily relied on Scripture and who fully accepted God's gift of grace and who wholeheartedly embraced this gift by faith. This is amazing, I would say, and this is so amazing that we stop at this point, because this third place needs some more thoughts, and I think I leave you with these thoughts for the week, and we enter again at this point, and keep on thinking about the third place and the consequences Luther derives from that. So if you don't have any question, I'm very happy to see you again next week, and I wish you a good time. See you next Tuesday, everybody. Be blessed. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.